Thank you, Jane, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Could I just begin by thanking Asham, Kelly and Daniel for that very beautiful welcome to country, and could I also acknowledge that we're all gathered on Kaurna land this morning, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge too that it was Kaurna people and Aboriginal people who were the first educators on this land. A big thank you to SASPA and to Jane and to Eva and the whole team for all the work that you do every day for our schools, but also I know the enormous effort that has gone into putting the conference together. You do it in a very, very professional way, and I say that as someone who attends a lot of peak body conferences and conventions like this, and I know that this is extremely well organised, and could I also say extremely well attended. I think it was 296 registrations and people from all over the state that you mentioned before, which is a huge effort, but I think it speaks to the support that SASPA has amongst the actual profession, but certainly enjoys a very, very high level of support and respect at the cabinet table, always has, regardless of who the government is and whatever the political persuasion of the government is. But it is certainly one of those representative groups, professional groups, that speaks with authority when it speaks in the media. And, I think there are varying degrees of respect given to professional groups in the media. But when, Jane and Eva and other representatives of SASPA come out to make comment about an issue that's occurred or a policy that the government has released at that time, SASPA is a group that is given a very, very high level of respect amongst our community, and I thank you for that, because it's very, very important for public education as a whole that we have people from the profession speaking to defend it and speak around what needs to happen. So obviously the theme, as we've heard this morning, is around equitable excellence, context matters, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity just to speak to you for a while this morning around my observations as Minister around why that is so important. But for me, I've had what you would describe as a different kind of week. This week I committed to going and spending a couple of full days at a school in the classroom. I elected to do that at Swallowcliffe Peter Seven School out in Davern Park. I'm going to do the same thing at a secondary school next year as well. I haven't decided where I might go and do that. Some of you might not want to have me there. Some of you may want to have me there. That is fine. But the idea was that I actually spend time just in classrooms, just sitting and observing, helping where I can, but trying to get a better feel for the challenges that you and your staff are dealing with every single day. And it's always struck me as someone who's been around education. I'm not an educator, but I've been around government and education for more than 10 years now, that there is always a kind of disconnect, which is very hard to breach, between what actually happens in classrooms and decisions that are made at 31 Flinders Street and next door at the cabinet table in government. And it sort of feels sometimes that no matter what we seek to do to bridge that gap, we're not always very successful at doing it. And this week and Tuesday was my first day in at Swallowcliffe. I think for me went to show that a heap of things we assume as ministers, we assume at 31 Flinders Street, based on the absolute best advice, research and evidence that we've got that gets presented to me that is supposed to flow up from you and your sites. Nothing replaces actually going and seeing the dynamic at a school. You can't. There's no shortcut for a minister or the department or any of our public servants to actually going and seeing it. And the day I spent on Tuesday was proof of that for me. I'm back there after I speak here this morning. I'm spending the day out at Swallowcliffe again. But what made this week really different and kind of fortuitous was, as Jane said, I was in Canberra yesterday. So the days at Swallowcliffe have bookended a day in Canberra fighting for us to get the full 5% for our schools to get up to 100% of Gonski, which you may or may not have heard is about $190 million per year for us, additional money, which is an awfully big chunk of money for all the South Australian context in terms of where that can go. And I was sitting on the plane on the red eye yesterday, thinking about what I would say, because I was standing next to Prue Carr, the Education Minister from New South Wales, who has well and truly been using the flamethrower in these negotiations. Ben Carroll, Deputy Premier and Education Minister in Victoria, Di Farmer, Education Minister Queensland, and Yvette Berry, who the Education Minister in the ACT, who, despite the fact they're already at 100%, is coming along to show solidarity for the public education systems in other states and territories. And we stood on the lawns of Parliament House with students. One I want to give a shout out to, Madison from Seaton, who actually got up, incredibly nerve-wracking thing to do for anyone to stand in front of a whole range of cameras with their lights on and say something. But Madison spoke incredibly passionately and with a great deal of authority. But when I was thinking about what I was going to say, my mind immediately went to the day I'd had before at Swallow Cliff. And I just spoke around what I'd seen in the classroom. And that was, I chose Swallow Cliff because I think it's a school that's doing great things. It's a school with just about the most disadvantaged, probably demographic and cohort of students and parents off the lands. And I wanted to see the challenges that they were having up close. So I got to take the things I had seen out of that classroom and relay them in front of the TV cameras and draw the link between what I'd seen and why the extra $190 million matters in terms of equity and excellence and all the things that we are talking about today. Because the challenge for all of us here in winning this debate and getting the money is explaining why it matters, because we are locked in this perennial debate now around, well, if NAPLAN results or PISA results, for instance, aren't going up like we said they would or we want them to, and you can just sit aside your views on the value of those tests for a moment. But the argument that's very easy to make is that because they have not gone up over the time that Gonski was first announced by Julia Gillard, then what's the point of that money and what's the point of that National Schools Reform Agreement? There are a lot of people nationally who are trying to make that case now. The federal coalition government has said that if they win government, and that will be an election not too far away, then discussions around extra money under that agreement from the federal government will stop. So this is our last chance. And their case is very much that because we haven't seen the boost in that academic achievement and those standardised tests that we said would come by virtue of this extra money to flow under the model devised by David Gonski, then it's all a complete waste of time and don't bother. Now, they are making that argument for spurious reasons because they don't want to spend the money. They don't believe in the people who are making that argument didn't want to spend the money on public schools in the first place. Don't be fooled by that. They had no interest in ever doing it. But what they've grabbed now is what they think is a very powerful public argument to say it doesn't work, the money is wasted. So the only way I think that we can ameliorate that and, in a convincing manner to the Australian public mount an argument about why it does matter is to tell individual stories from your sites. So the stories I told yesterday was around sitting in a classroom of about 25, I think it was year 3 students, and a teacher and an SSO and one young kid with autism in the class who was really dysregulated, absolutely flying around the class, jumping into my lap, jumping on my head, all that kind of stuff, zooming between different things, and the teacher trying to teach to the rest of the class who was sitting there on the floor, keen to learn, while this young fella was just zipping all over the place and he was happy as Larry, but causing havoc. And the way that that class and that teacher dealt with it, of course, was the SSO, what was there and was funded to offer support to the teacher, and the whole class was put full-time on that young lad so that he could be calmed and do some work in the corner, which was great. There was only access to that SSO for a few hours in the morning each day, not the whole day, and I'm seeing heads nod already. And of course, it also meant that not only was there not that support in the afternoon at all, but that SSO who was also funded to be there to offer support to the teacher and all the members of the class weren't getting that because our funding didn't reach. Now, that's a consideration and issue for us at 31 Flinders Street around how we make that money go further. There's some comments I could make around the level of IESP funding that young lad attracted, which, in my mind, wasn't as high a level as I would have thought, given his complexities and given the challenges that his teacher and yes, I know. Well, I told you I was going to be honest about it, so strap yourselves in. I know these are things you know, but what I'm trying to tell you is that these are the stories we have to tell, and these are the things I'm acknowledging that I am seeing and that I know to be true, but they go to the heart of why we need that $190 million of extra money, because that young fella there is not on a level 9 and probably could have been on a level 9 of IESP funding. The SSO for that class is between 9 and 12, 5 days a week, not between 9 and 3, 5 days a week, and there will be disparities in the way that we work these things out at 31 Flinders Street. I accept that. It is a hard thing to get right, but our bucket is only so big. And I know that people hate it when politicians say that, but it is true. And we really stretched ourselves through the enterprise bargaining agreement process to come to a agreement there. The changes we made to IESP, although only the start, that's an extra $50 million there as well that we've put to make those first 3 supplementary categories things that can be site funded. If we are to make the next step on any of those issues, we have to access that $190 million extra money. But I think the only way that we actually are able to mount a public argument which is going to actually cut through, not just to the federal government and the people making the decisions, but mums and dads sitting at home watching TV on the news and wondering why this is an extra $190 million of taxpayer money that should go to South Australia, is just drilling right down into individual stories of what is happening in classrooms. The only way we are going to win this battle is by talking about individual stories. The high level kind of stuff around the aims behind the original kind of Gonski needs-based funding model, it's not cutting through. People get it, and those who are not supporters of it in the first place are seeking to dismantle it by pointing to all our standardised tests and saying that that system has failed. And we are at a really important juncture here, because if those who seek to dismantle that needs-based funding model system win, we can see situations like the ones that I've experienced on Tuesday and you experience every single day and have for years, I understand that, worsen, because there will be less money. The bucket won't grow to accommodate. There'll be less individual support. There'll be less allied health support. There'll be less, we won't have the same or the adequate numbers of SSOs to be there in the classroom. The level of funding that goes to the individual child will not be enough to meet the actual needs that they have. And that is the slow kind of decline that we can expect to see. And where does that kind of finish? What's the nadir, if I could put it that way, for that slow decline? And I would point to what has happened in New South Wales. So we know that the funding model that works in all states is largely around enrolments. How much money does the Education Department get on an annual basis in the budget to fund schools and to go to you is based largely on how many students we have at secondary schools and primary schools and preschools. Now, what has been a very steady decline in enrolments in public education in New South Wales over more than a decade saw this year a huge chunk of money come out, probably the biggest cut they have seen. And Prukar had to deal with that. And of course, it was characterised as though the government chopping money out of public education. And in some ways, that is right. But in other ways, it was just because enrolments had declined for so long. The number of students there, when the number crunchers got the calculator out at the Department of Treasury and worked out how much money would go to education that year, was hundreds of millions of dollars less because there weren't as many students. So the task and the job now for the New South Wales public education system to lift itself out of that mire, rebuild enrolments, attract more New South Wales families to choose public education, just got disproportionately harder than it's ever been because they have less money to do it than they have ever had. And then you are on the pretty fast track to the residualisation of your public education system and essentially run the risk eventually of creating ghettos of public schools where the only families who choose to go there are those who don't have the means to go anywhere else. And then you're basically at the end. You're basically at the end. And I don't want to see that, because once you get to that stage, it's very hard to lift yourself out of it. And that's what we need to avoid in South Australia. and why your conference theme today particularly is so incredibly important, because it is around equity, it is around excellence, and we have a harder job in public education here and everywhere else in Australia to achieve that than we have ever had, ever. All the data points to how hard it is now, because we've got, I think the figure we used, that Ben Carroll used yesterday was, he might have said 77% of students with a disability in Australia are in what system? The public system. And that's just kids with disabilities. A whole heap of other complexities and challenges that you could add on top of disability, and they're all disproportionately in the public education system too. And that concentration of disadvantage that we're seeing has just gone like this. And that's making your job harder every single day, because we are the system that turns no one away. We are the system that has to accommodate everybody. We're the system that has to find a way to educate that young fellow who was flying around the classroom, another kid who got dysregulated later in the day and ripped all the artwork down and upended all the sanitizer bottles down the hallway, after being at school for 15 minutes and being told that he'd spelt a word that should have had 2 E's with 1 E, and deciding that was it and losing the plot, and next minute 3 staff are trying to calm him. And we don't get to turn that kid away, and nor would we want to, nor should we. But what is it that we need to do to make sure that we can accommodate and cater to all those families and all those kids? And, you guys are doing everything right. Our staff and our schools are doing everything right. I walked away on Tuesday from Swallow Cliff with the most kind of uplifting kind of feeling around how good our staff and our schools are. I mean, I was walking away from what the data tells us is one of the most disadvantaged schools in a metropolitan area, probably in Australia, in terms of the cohort of families, their upward mobility, their income, whether they're employed, health outcomes, all that kind of stuff. All those targets are down. But the 477 kids there on that day had a great day at school, and they were learning. But that was thanks to the incredible work of the teachers and the SSOs and the leadership there. So I feel that despite all the incredible challenges that we do have and you have in front of you, and despite the fact that I think the job is disproportionately getting harder, there's just no doubt about that. I've used the anecdote about my father's own experience in the public education system in country Victoria a lot. I'm not going to bore you with that story again, but when he finished in 2012, that was his observation after 40 years about how harder the job was. And it's only got harder in the 12 years since he's finished. And every site I go to, and I try to make an effort to speak to staff who've been in the system a long time and get their thoughts and their reflections on what's changed in their time. And it's exactly the same story every time, every single time, no matter where I go. Behaviour worse, parental behaviour worse, job harder, workload higher. But my message to you today is that I accept those things as Minister. Martin accepts those things as the Chief Executive, and we are doing things to try to tackle it. But I do think we also, after giving you a heap of bad news, I do think there is good news. There is really good news in terms of South Australia. And I know, politicians have got a bad habit of always, telling people that the whole world's watching us and everyone's looking at South Australia and blah-de-blah. And, you guys probably take that with a grain of salt. But I can tell you, going to ministerial meetings with Jason Clare and all the other education ministers, the amount of time that they raise with me the things we're trying to do here, I think is proof that we're willing to do things differently to try to tackle these issues. We are, again, I think, finding a way to be the state like we used to be, that would be the innovator and try things that have maybe a degree of risk or things that other states and territories aren't willing to do to try to combat the problems that we see. But the opportunity, as I see it now for us, is the alignment. Really, there's really, really rare alignment in terms of the themes of this conference today, around equity, excellence, context matters, but I would say alignment between that and the public education strategy, which talks about equity and excellence, well-being for learning and engagement, and a strong and sustainable workforce. But also the things that we are focusing on as part of what we hope will be the next Gonski Agreement. It's the same things. It's equity, it's excellence, it is around context and how we better support sites in rural, regional areas, sites with greater disadvantage, greater complexity. Now, there are people in this room who've been involved in education in one way or another far, far longer than I have. But I would challenge those people to be able to remember a time in our state where the strategy of the department, the strategy of our peak groups like SASPA, and the strategy of the federal government in terms of what it wants to tie all that national schools reform money to, the billions, where they actually aligned and were talking about the same thing. I can never remember it. I can never remember the three talking about the same thing and everyone agreeing on what needs to be done. And that is a huge part of the problem, is that we are so often out of alignment and pulling in different directions and not working together and disagreeing on fundamental stuff, like what should be in the curriculum, these endless bloody wars around what, politicians engaging themselves in what exactly should be taught in the curriculum, because it's always easier to have a culture war than it is to talk about the real difficult problems in there around, the funding and support that's needed for kids with learning problems or autism, whatever it is. Much easier just to make a big hullabaloo about, how much of Australia's white history and Australia's Aboriginal history we're teaching, for example. But finally, we're in a place where the focus of all those three key areas, the profession itself and its representative groups like SASPA, the education department and the federal government in terms of the only 20% of money it gives to public schools, hopefully soon to be 25%, actually agree should be our goals and aims. So I say to you that we have an opportunity to do something now by really pushing and locking that in. Because if we can lock in the national agreement and not just the money we need, the $190 million extra, but importantly, agreement on where it goes. Because Jason Clare, in his defence, is being pushed hard by those people who say that Gonski's been a waste of money. You should send it all somewhere else. Rip it out of schools. Rip it out of schools. So I cut him some slack in the sense that although we are at the pointy end of negotiations around who pays for it, the things that he is talking about that it should go to are the things that you're telling me it should go to. And that's a change, and it's a really positive change. So I just want to finish by really saying a huge thank you to SASPA, but a huge thank you to what you all do in your schools. It is, I know it's a really, really tough job, a job that's getting tougher, and you're doing it in an environment where there are other job opportunities out there, to be perfectly frank. I was a young girl who's here today from Lefevre. Sorry that I forgot your name. Sophie? Sophie from Lefevre. I asked her what she wanted to do after year 12, which I know is a question that year 11 students hate getting from grown-ups, but anyway. And she said teaching. And I get a huge thrill when I hear that, a huge thrill that we still have people like Sophie who are motivated to go and do your job, even though they understand that it's a difficult one, and that there are other, at this stage, in our state and elsewhere, there are a lot of other jobs out there which don't have the stress and heartache that your job does. But as I said, and I'm looking forward to getting out to a high school and spending some time next year somewhere, but the best medicine for a bad day, I think, is going to a school and seeing what you guys do, because you are just people who are overwhelmingly motivated by trying to help young people, trying to lift them up, trying to change their lives. And there are very, very few professions in the world that are truly motivated by something like that. And I acknowledge it. And I think that together we can actually achieve some really good things in the next 12 months, because we do have that agreement and alignment between the things you guys think need to happen, the things that I know need to happen, and the things the federal government needs to happen as well. And thank you all for giving me the chance to come and speak to you today. Thank you all, those of you who have welcomed me to your sites. Really appreciate the way that you do that and giving me your honest advice. It means a lot to me. And of course, again, a really big thank you to Jane, Eva and the SASPA team. I've got to thank Jane, given that she's the outgoing chief executive. How can I say something which is justifies and acknowledges the work that Jane's done? She's been a huge support for me. Rock solid, has been called upon to stand up and do media at very, very short notice on very, very difficult things. But I can't tell you how important it is for me, and all my predecessors as ministers would say the same thing, to have someone from the profession, from such a respected group, stand up and back you in on things. There'll be times we disagree, but when Jane has done that, she has done that on issues that are tough, that I would find difficult to talk about because they would be politicised. And Jane has taken up the baton and done that and represented you in such a good way. And she has the respect of this minister, all the ministers before, the Premier and Cabinet. I know I will really miss having you. there to be able to call and get your advice on things. But whoever's going to take over, I wish them all the best. And thank you very much, Jane, for all your years of service to public education. And thank you for having me.